Call to order the New Kent County Board of Supervisors, May 29th, 2024 meeting to order. Ms. Watkins, will you call the roll of the board, please?
Mr. Evelyn?
Here.
Mr. Moyer?
Here.
Ms. Pearson?
Here.
Mr. Steers?
Here.
And Ms. Stewart?
Here.
Thank you. Also this morning, we have the Planning Commission with us. We have joint meeting. Welcome. Mr. Bennett, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the May 29th meeting of the Planning Commission. If you would please, Ms. Berry, call the roll.
Ms. Townsend?
Here.
Ms. Johnson? Mr. Moyer?
Here.
Mr. Dombrowski?
Here.
Ms. Thomas? Mr. La Rochelle? Dr. Schmidt? Mr. Davis?
Here.
Ms. Rose?
Here.
Reverend Hathaway?
Here.
Mr. Bennett?
Here. Thank you. We do have a quorum. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. Our first item this morning is the New Kent 2045 Comprehensive Plan Progress Update. Todd Gordon with EPR.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Been working with county staff and steering committee for the past 18 months or so to update the county's comprehensive plan. So I want to share some background information for the good of any new members, let you know where we are, but the main objective of today's meeting is to talk to you about the future land use map, which is probably the most important feature of the comprehensive plan. Now, make this there. All right. I'm trying my best to make this mouse work. So as a board, the Board of Supervisors appointed a steering committee to help guide the formation of this plan, and so our job is to put together the plan at their direction. They've been a great group to work with. We thank them for all their support and guidance. So we've worked with that group through kind of analysis of existing conditions, through 2 phases of public input meetings, and are now working on future land use and tactics to accomplish goals in the future. There we go. So first, some general information about the project. Some of you may know comprehensive planning well, and others maybe not as much. The comprehensive plan is state required. It's a requirement of state code. The comprehensive plan is meant to plan for the future needs of your population. The typical comprehensive plan looks about 20 years into the future. We've been aiming for about 2045. So the comprehensive plan is not a legal requirement. The comprehensive plan is a guidance document. It's meant to be something that helps to guide the decision making that the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors do on a daily basis. The comprehensive plan is an attempt to say, you know, with all these little decisions, are we still pointed in the direction that we want to go as a county? So it provides long-range guidance on transportation. Typical comprehensive plan fare. The chapters from your existing plan are listed here. The history of the county, natural resources and hazards, public facilities, parks and recreation, water, sewer, and septic services, agriculture, economy, housing, and the 2 big ones are really transportation and land use. So the last major update of the comprehensive plan for New Kent was done in 2012. There have been some small changes along the way in the years since. So again, those existing plan chapters are listed there. Now the county also did a strategic plan in 2021. That plan does a lot of work to establish a community vision, goals for the future, and the general direction of the county. It's very much a foundation for the comprehensive plan and the discussions that we've been having with the steering committee. So this comprehensive plan will go maybe a layer deeper into strategies, particularly for land use and transportation. All right. There's a project website, newkent2045.com, where we've kind of maintained the schedule, We've had some surveys available on that site during the 2 phases of public engagement to let people know about upcoming meetings, posted draft documents at that website. The process of the plan looks a bit like this. We're certainly very near the end of this process. We went through, again, 2 phases of public engagement where we looked at data on the growth of the county and to try to project future needs, set up some of the framework and mapping of land use and transportation. We're late in the process. There will be a 3rd phase of public engagement when we finish confirming the kind of draft materials of the plan. There will be another phase of public engagement so that residents can weigh in on, does this effectively capture where they plan to go? And then it will go to adoption later in the summer. But as I mentioned, the state mandate is that you use the comprehensive plan to plan for the future needs of your population. And no news to any of you, New Kent is a growing county. You've grown pretty spectacularly over the past several decades. In projecting future growth, we look to the Weldon Cooper Center. That's the official state demographer hosted by the University of Virginia, who estimates that the future population of New Kent by about 2050 will be 36,000 people. So that's an addition of about 11,000 roughly over where you are now, which represents continued relatively strong growth pressure. So that's kind of the basis of data that we're starting from. Again, public input is a big part of this plan. There have been 2 phases so far with 1 more phase planned. The first phase of public engagement was focused on understanding the community's vision for the future, what their priorities are. There was a public open house held at the beginning of the plan, as well as an online survey, which got another 500 or so responses. We asked people, what are your goals for the future? What do you feel is going well in New Kent? What do you feel needs improvement in New Kent? And so on. A second phase of public engagement was very focused on land use and transportation. We used some interactive type workshops where we put land use and transportation maps on the table and ask people to mark them up, tell us where growth belongs, where growth does not belong, where they see transportation safety issues and traffic issues and so on. We held 3 meetings in that round to try to cover the county geographically. We did a kind of an east, a middle, and a west. There was also an online map that people could do the same sort of input, so we used that as well. So we collected great input about areas for growth, areas for preservation. Overall, I think we heard from the residents that they generally support and understand the kind of direction of the previous version of the comprehensive plan. They understand that growth comes, that it may be inevitable, but they would like to see growth contained in specific areas of the county. And this has been the policy for some time, to try to contain growth near the interstate exits, near major transportation, where it can be served, by public utilities, and use that as a way to preserve the rural areas, the rural character, the agricultural nature of the county, particularly the outlying areas. People told us that they understood growth. They were particularly interested in commercial growth, the kind of growth that provides jobs, provides services to a lot of the residences that have been built over the past few decades. A strong desire to preserve the rural area, and a desire to maintain the really good level of service that you all already have when it comes to police and fire and rescue and administration and schools, et cetera. So a big part, as I mentioned, of the comprehensive plan, probably the central feature of the plan, is the future land use map. The future land use map is a kind of generalized vision of growth and development in the future. The existing land use map, the one from the 2012 plan, looks like this. It divides the county into 11 different land use types. So areas for village type development, areas for commercial development, areas for economic development, industrial areas, but also areas of rural land, for agricultural preservation, for environmental conservation. So that's the basis we started with. Again, that general scheme of maintaining or trying to contain growth near interstate interchanges in appropriate locations to preserve the rest of the county. So we worked with the steering committee on revising this plan. Are any adjustments necessary? So again, we heard from the public that the general direction is good. So we're looking at the details of how can this map be useful to the county in the future. So it's important to remember how the map works. So again, the comprehensive plan is a guidance document. It's not a legal requirement the way that zoning is. So one way to think about the future land use map may be to consider it a map of how the county might be zoned 20 plus years into the future. So the future land use map is meant to be an indication from the county to the development community, to private property owners of what sort of development and in what areas the county is willing to consider. Because we have to remember that all these parcels in the county, very, very few of them actually belong to the county. They belong to private landowners, and ultimately the decision of if to develop property and how to develop it lies very much with the landowner, with the developer, with the market. So in working with the steering committee on how we might want to update this map, the decision was that, I said the old map has 11 categories. The decision was that we might simplify that and use 9 categories in the future. So 2 big changes there. We've eliminated one of the land use types that was called the rural crossroads. It was it was confined to 4 intersections within the county, 4 rural intersections, and meant to allow a sort of corner store or something like that. The idea was that that was too small to really effectively implement, and the suggestion was that we remove that. The existing land use map also shows planned unit development on the map. Now, planned unit development is a very good tool for building projects, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what sort of development it is. Planned unit development might be houses on large lots, it might be houses on small lots, might contain commercial, might contain industrial, not industrial, but institutional type use, schools and churches. So we preferred to show those by their use rather than as a planned unit development. So what we're left with are the 9 types: conservation, agriculture and forestry, rural lands, hamlet, village. These are both sort of mixed use types at different scales. Also residential, commercial, economic opportunity, and industrial. And then we want to use the plan to describe each of these uses in some form that's useful to you all as you weigh future development proposals. The 2012 plan gives some general description of these use types, but for this plan we worked with the steering committee to describe them according to 9 sort of characteristics. What is the intent of each land use? What uses would be found in it? What's generally the density from low to high? The character of buildings, the character of open and public spaces, connectivity, that is transportation, both vehicles and walking, multimodal transportation, so that's the walking and biking, utilities and infrastructure, and then potential zoning categories. So we need to think about how each of these generalized land use categories translates into zoning. All right, and so I handed out this chart with apologies for the small text size. This is an attempt to show all 9 characteristics for all 9 land use types. So potentially difficult to read. We will likely spread this information out over several pages in the plan to make it easier to digest. But for example, it provides, if we look at the village category, The village category is confined to some very small areas of the county, the Courthouse Village, Bottoms Bridge, Providence Forge, as an area for both residential or potentially commercial use, potentially the higher density of development for the county. The character of buildings, should be matching and within the historic character of the county. Parks and open space provided. Space for civic buildings, governmental buildings, schools provided. In areas of mixed-use development, that's an area where sidewalks should be, as opposed to out in the rural areas where sidewalks are not expected. So this is all provided here. Would be difficult to go through the entire chart with you in the time you have allotted, but your input on this information and how we display it is very welcome. And this chart goes along with the map itself. So earlier, a few slides ago, I showed the 2012 version of the future land use map. We worked with the steering committee, again, not to make major changes, but to suggest potential improvements to this map. And we have summarized those on a map that I've also handed out. This shows the existing land uses and then several spaces that are dashed in and marked with letters explaining where the steering committee and we found where we might want to make small changes. So from the west end of the county, this slide to change. There we go. So from the west end of the county, again, the steering committee saw fit to eliminate what was described as a rural crossroads in the previous plan. And one of those rural crossroads, for example, was 249 and Henpeck Road. Being immediately adjacent to some place that was already called a village, under the one marked N, suggested that we expand the village designation to include that intersection. Again, marked A is a location along 60 where there's property that was surrounded by things that were called village. It made sense to expand that as an area that's already served by utilities, so that's an area where development might make sense. Another thing that was done when thinking about revisions to this map is to include developments that have been proposed or even been built since 2012. So where residential developments have come along, to show those on this map, just to be realistic about what already exists. Once built, those residences will be, that will be the future land use. So several proposed developments marked, O, P, and B, residential developments marked. We also took a sort of realistic look at lands that were already zoned industrial and marked them within the industrial category on the future land use map. So C and R, C being the airport, R being an area around exit 211 that also has some industrial zoning. A couple of changes in the area of Farms of New Kent, Talliesville area. The space marked E will be, and mark that for future economic opportunity use. There's also a parcel marked Q that was previously included as part of a PUD, as a village designation, that it's our understanding that's now been taken out and deed restricted. So we want to show that as rural lands because it's been restricted to that by its owners. So we'll move to the next one. Marked T is an area that was shown in the previous plan as a rural crossroads. That's the 155 and 249. That's an area that shows some commercial development now, so it is a bit of a unimportant crossroads. We put that into the hamlet category since we eliminated the rural crossroads category as an area where small commercial development may be appropriate. We also showed on J. J is just adjacent to where we are now in the Courthouse Village. as areas of potential development adjacent to the village that can take advantage of the services, schools, and so on that are available here at the courthouse. Moving slightly south and east, this map shows the Providence Forge area. A few suggested changes there. There's a parcel marked H that was previously shown as part of the Providence Forge Village. The steering committee suggested that that was because it's in some ways across a creek from Providence Forge, that it may not be appropriate to include in the village, at least at this time. So we removed that back to rural lands. There's also a parcel I that was marked as part of Providence Forge for development, but that the steering committee pointed out and staff pointed out that was likely not environmentally suitable for development at all. Marked V is the third rural crossroads that we removed, in this case putting it back to the rural lands designation. On the next map, a parcel marked K there that's zoned industrial, so we want to be realistic about its future use, that industrial zoning is not likely to go away. Parcel W is McKimmie Woods. That's a parcel that now belongs to the county, shown as conservation use there next to the reservoir. And on the final map, parcel X is the fourth rural crossroads that we removed. So that was suspended between an area for economic opportunity and an area for industrial development. So we filled in with adjacent use. And then parcel L is an area that we've shown for residential development, was previously shown rural. However, it's already subdivided into very small lots in the village of Eltham, so it may be appropriate to develop that as such in the future. So understand this is a lot of information. I think the takeaway overall is that we're suggesting some relatively minor, we think, and modest changes to the map, in large part to respond to development that's already proposed or approved, in order to make some procedural changes by removing that rural crossroad designation, and by showing properties by their use rather than calling them planned unit development, to be more realistic about their use. But continuing the overall drive that New Kent County has had for many years, again, to attempt to concentrate development and future growth in appropriate locations where it's served by roads, served by public utilities, in order to preserve or reduce development pressure on outlying rural land. So I'm very happy to receive any input or answer any questions. I'll just say that the next steps for this project is to complete the drafting of the individual chapters, the text of the chapters. So each chapter will include the data, the background information on your growth, on your facilities, et cetera. Will include the goals from the strategic plan, as well as tactics to achieve those, as well as some information on the public input that was received on each topic. So, for example, chapter on public utilities, some information on what the public had to say about public utilities. When we are closer to or at the stage where we have the plan drafted, which we expect to have within the next month, to do a third round of public engagement, hold a meeting where the public can see some of the products, to make the text available through the project website for people to review, make any suggestions to be sure that it achieves the vision that they're pointed towards. Following that, to make any revisions, and then work for the adoption of the plan. So first, make sure the steering committee that's been appointed to guide this plan is happy, have it recommended by the Planning Commission, and then approved by the Board of Supervisors. So that's where we are. I realize there's quite a lot of information on those two sheets I handed you, but I think the big takeaway is that folks are understanding of the growth pressure that you all receive, generally supportive of the work that's been done to try to concentrate growth in certain locations while preserving others, and to bring economic development, jobs and services to the county over the past few years. So that's where we are. I'm happy to hear any input and to answer any question, either now or post-meeting.
Any planning commissioners or board members, anybody have any questions or comments?
You can go ahead, Mr. Hathaway. I have one question, but you can go ahead first.
Todd, and looking at the map, I just noticed along Route 60, there is a large state-owned property. I believe it's called Crawford Forest.
Yeah.
We should identify this, and staff can help you identify that. That should probably deserve a conservation classification.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ms. Stewart?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I preface this question with, I am not a professional planner, so I really rely on my planning commissioners to do the job. They're much more qualified than I am to do. But looking at the elimination of the rural crossroads designation, you said it was too small to effectively implement. Aren't small things easier to implement? Or is this our nice way of saying it's not worth our time implementing anymore? Or what's the...
I think the argument from us and from the steering committee was that because that designation landed on so few properties that it would be difficult to implement. And in a lot of cases, these rural crossroads were sort of at the intersection of larger parcels, and so that designation would have applied to only one small corner of a larger parcel that was otherwise designated rural. And that was the kind of complication of potentially implementing.
Got it. And were there any other designations that were few in number, or was this the only one?
That was the fewest. It was only 4 spots, and each spot was maybe a 10 to 20 acre circle in 4 intersections, and so it was quite small. Some of the others are not, the hamlet and village designations aren't on a lot of properties, but they're on important properties, and in most cases cover the whole parcel.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, we have a lot of historic sites scattered throughout the county. Is there an attempt for historic preservation sites, or are they just simply allowed throughout?
So historic preservation and the history of the county are something that will be in the plan, and while those sites are not shown on this map, every intention is to have them mapped within the plan. And so while this map is sort of a generalized look at where development might be appropriate, ultimately that development is governed by your zoning ordinance and other requirements you have, including your desire to preserve historic buildings. So for example, if village development happened on parcel J, but there was a historic structure, there's every expectation that the historic structure would remain and development would respect it and work around it if possible.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thanks for recognizing that I wanted to speak, but it looks to me like the progress of the development is dictating the comprehensive plan instead of the comprehensive plan determining the development. Am I wrong?
That can happen.
Well, you have 24 changes on here.
Yep.
That have already changed because of businesses moving in or projected to move in, like in Buc-ee's, changed from residential to economic opportunity. So I know you said the comprehensive plan is not law, right?
Yeah.
So, so down the road, there can be even more changes. Am I right?
It's absolutely right that the comprehensive plan does not have legal standing to prevent development. And so it exists as a guide to the individual decisions that are made by Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors. And so, it sort of establishes the community's vision that this is an area, for example, a rural area that we would not like to see development. Ultimately, it has to come down to an individual decision. If a proposal comes before the county to develop that rural area, to look to the plan, to look to the input that was received by the public, and say no, or say this should be changed in order to
Mrs. Steers, I think you bring up a good point there, but I think it's fair to say also a lot of these developments that we see, they were a cluster. They've been a cluster subdivision that didn't come in front of the Planning Commission or the board. So now after changing that cluster ordinance, I think the Planning Commission and the board will have more say-so, and the citizens, about where the development is coming into this county. If you look at here, a lot of these are the cluster subdivisions that changed.
You have made some changes, and I think it's the hope of some staff and planning commission that following the comprehensive plan, that some examination is done of the zoning ordinance, which is the legally required regulatory instrument that you have to help implement the vision for the future. And so you've made some zoning changes by changing the clustered subdivision provision, but that you might look at that ordinance to see, does anything need to be changed in order to most effectively implement the vision?
Mr. Gordon, I think your map here is more of a reflection on how we did not look at our comp 5 years, and that we want to look at a comprehensive plan to be what we want in the way of planning, because these changes wouldn't have been made if we kept our comprehensive plan and zoning the way it was. We wouldn't be making all these changes. But I think this is valid to going forward to set this up so people know what to expect, where to expect it, and then the zoning will be the end all. So thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back over to you. I guess, do y'all have any more business?
Thank you, sir. Having no other business for the Planning Commission, unless there's a question, we're not able to take it. We don't have anything before us for voting. Is there any items that any of the commissioners present like to bring up? If not, and it's to permission of the Board of Supervisors, is there a motion to close our meeting? Thank you, Ms. Townsend. The meeting of the Planning Commission is now closed. Mr. Chairman, I return the floor to you. Those people who are need to exit, please do so quietly. If you could give us a moment.
Yes, sir. Thank you all for joining us today. I know this was a last-minute meeting, but I think it was important, so thank you for all y'all do for us and the citizens. We'll take like a 5-minute break. Call the meeting back to order. Our next item is the adoption of the revised New Kent County financial policies. Mr. Cole from Davenport.
Good morning.
Morning.
My colleague Ben Wilson's here with me. We had circulated something during the break, which is very brief. It's supporting information for the policies, which were in your agenda packet. I guess a couple of things just on the front end. Policies have been in place for a number of years. I think the original policies date back to 2006, and they've been amended from time to time, mostly expanded for some new concepts or clarifications, and that's largely what this most recent revision is. It has expanded some additional concepts, clarified some calculations and wording. What I can tell you is there shouldn't be anything in these policies that you all aren't already doing or you're out of compliance with. So if that gives you any comfort in terms of considering adoption, you're not all of a sudden going to be out of compliance or behind the curve on something that the policy calls for. The other thing I would emphasize is there are y'all's policies and subsequent boards' policies, so you always have the opportunity to make an exception, make a change. They're not mandated by any outside entity. It is a best practice to have policies like this in place, but you always have the opportunity or the discretion to consider making an exception to a policy. And for example, something like your fund balance, we want to maintain a certain level of fund balance. Well, the policy recognizes that there may be events that occur that you need to draw that fund balance down below the policy level, and the policy itself allows for that. What it asks is if you do that, you acknowledge that, and you adopt a plan to get it restored back into compliance over some period of time. Same on debt. There's some debt policies that may limit how much debt is outstanding at any point in time, but you have in there language that allows you to make an exception. So if you have a very important project that you want to pursue and you need to issue debt to do it, the fact that you might be out of compliance with one of your policies for a few years, while important to know, shouldn't necessarily stop you from doing the project. So again, you would have the discretion to make exceptions. The other thing that has been added that I think is important, and I'll start talking a little more specifically off of page 2 in this book. The third bullet lists about 4 items that we thought were new and important enough to sort of bring to your attention. The first is that we've included some language in here about Colonial Downs revenues, and it's in the operating budget section of the policy document, and it talks about that those dollars should be used for one-time expenditures, so capital or some other non-reoccurring expense or investment. Now, it does allow to make an exception for that. If there is something going on that is just creating a severe hardship and you need to do something else with those revenues, you can make that exception. So it goes back to the point that it gives guidance, it gives direction, but it doesn't absolutely require strict and unwavering compliance, because things arise and circumstances present themselves that we want to make sure you have flexibility. So that's one notable addition. The second is a general fund contingency reserve. That had been that it would be a minimum of $300,000, and now we have set it at to the greater of $300,000 or 1% of the budget. So as the budget is growing, that $300,000, if it's constant, is becoming less and less relevant to the size of the budget. So the thought was allow that minimum threshold, or not allow, require that minimum threshold grow as the budget grows, so it maintains its relevance and it has provides a meaningful cushion to your budget. And the budget is at the size now where I believe the 1% is what drives that calculation. The budget has gotten to a point where 300,000 is really not the test. It's going to be 1%. Thirdly, an annual review. We thought it would be good as part of the policies to say that the policies should be included in the annual budget process. It gives you all or subsequent boards the opportunity to at least review them and understand them specific to that budget. And if there is a need or a desire to make adjustments to it, it creates a process where you can do that. And it also would provide for a regular adoption of the policy. So that was the third item we wanted to note. And then finally, on public utilities, I know Ben had presented at the board retreat not only a general fund model, but a utility model, and we've maintained that model for a number of years. And one of the things that has been flowing through that utility model from the very beginning is making sure that the utility system has adequate reserves, and it's insulating the general fund, the tax-supported side of the county, from having to support the utilities. And so we looked at that and made a decision that we would reword that slightly so that the minimum level of reserves in that fund would be $3 million or 50% of the utility budget. And all of our modeling that we've done over the years, we've targeted 50% as a minimum or $3 million. Again, the budget has gotten to a point on the utility fund where the 50% would be the relevant calculation and won't change anything on the modeling that we've done, the modeling that Ben presented in March. Fairly straightforward additions. There are some other wording changes and, things that are, a little more minutia, but again, nothing in here, in our opinion, that would be a burden to the county, something that would create a new obligation, nothing like that. We did include in this presentation some supporting information for some of the ratios that are in the policy, so actual calculations. Before I flip through that, though, I guess if there's any questions on these items or anything else you might have seen in the document, happy to try to answer those.
I have a question. Mr. Hathaway, the total of our budget that we're approving today, Mr. Cole said that he thought that the driving force would be the 1%, but I think we only have 300,000. Does that cover the 1% at this point?
No, we currently have 300,000 planned for our reserve for contingency fund. If this policy is adopted, that will be the target for our next budget process.
For the next fiscal year 26 budget process. Okay.
I'm sorry, if this financial policy is adopted, that will be the target.
Does that apply to the Colonial Downs revenue also? Or is that?
That would be the board's discretion, although it would be staff's recommendation.
It would be good practice for us to pay it back.
So. It would be good practice, yes.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Okay, I'll just go through these slides quickly, and I'll start on page 4. This just gives you a single snapshot of the county's tax-supported debt that's outstanding. In the bottom left, you can see it's a little over $65 million. About $40 million of that has been issued over the years to support school projects, and about $25 million for non-school projects. The utilities is not included in this as tax-supported. And you can see either graphically or on the right-hand side, the current debt service budget is about $8.5 million a year out of the general fund or the tax-supported side of the budget. That far right column, it's called 10-year payout ratio. That is one of the policies, and I'll talk about it in a moment, and it's measured in percentage, and what it's measuring is of that $65 million of principal, in the schedule that you have, you're retiring under principal about $6.5 million a year. In the next 10 years, how much of that $65 million will have been repaid if you follow this schedule? And you'll see you're sitting at about 72%. So said another way, 10 years from now, 72% of this debt will have been repaid. Higher is better. It means you're amortizing debt more quickly. You're not backloading it. And you'll see here in a moment, you have a policy and you're in compliance with that. If you go to page 5, this is where we touch on the specific debt policies. And again, our goal here was to make sure everybody's comfortable with the policy itself, and you'll also see that you are in compliance. So on page 5, we're looking at debt to assess value. So the amount of debt outstanding, $65 million, as a percent of the total tax base, roughly $5 billion. You're at about 1.3% and declining over time, right, because debt's paying down. You have a policy that says you don't want to exceed 4.5%, so you're well below that policy. Lower is better, and within that policy, you certainly have capacity to issue additional debt. That doesn't mean it's affordable. It doesn't mean there's a way to repay it, but the capacity is there. And on the right-hand side of this page, what we've done, just to give you a little more perspective, and you might have seen it at the retreat, is just shown how New Kent compares in debt to assess value to other rated counties nationally in the light green and within Virginia in the dark green. Again, lower is better, and what you can see, particularly to your Virginia peers, either AAA, AA, or single A, you're right in line with the peers, and those blue lines indicate the min and the max for each group, and you can see there are people that are getting closer to 3%. Again, lower is better. So at 4.5, it's a good policy, and clearly you're well within that, and no real concerns there. Same basic idea on page 6. However, what we're measuring here is the debt service per year, call it $8.5 million, as a percent of your budget. And you have a policy that says we don't want to go above 12%. You're below it, although you're closer on this one than the other one. So this is, of your debt policies, this is probably the one that's a bit more limiting. You're sitting at just under 11%. But as the budget grows and as you're paying down debt, that should provide a little bit of cushion. This is one, whenever we start talking about capital planning, long-term capital planning that might require debt, this is the one that usually we hit the threshold the soonest. But you can also see on the right, while you're a little above the medians, you're above those dark green bars for Virginia counties, you can see there are also counties that are 15, 16%. So with this one, lower is better. You have a very good policy at 12. You're below it by a little bit. And again, we'll watch this as we pick up on any capital planning work as we go forward. And then lastly, on the debt policies, page 7, this is that 10-year payout. And on this one, higher is better. You want to show you're retiring debt more quickly. So the policy actually says we don't want to fall below 50%, meaning in the next 10 years, you want at least half the debt to be paid back. You're sitting at 72%. Higher is better. So you're well above your policy, and you can also see relative to those peers on the right, again, you want your bar further to the right of that slide, you're in good shape. So all of the debt policies, which are not new, by the way, they've been in there for a while, you're in compliance, everything looks good, and again, the language does exist if there's ever a need to make an exception for you to be able to consider that. Page 9, a little bit about the general fund balance. Policy says that you want to have at least 15% as 15% of the revenue. So as the budget is growing, the reserve level should be growing. This is the unassigned component of the fund balance, which you can find in the audit. That is the component of fund balance that has the least amount of restrictions on it. You all have the most control over it. And you can see there's a calculation that we've done for the last 5 years. There's a fair number of moving parts to that calculation, but it's, staff does it, and on a regular basis, it's looking at the audit, the final results of the year, looking at that year's budget, and making necessary transfers out to a capital improvement fund. And you've been working by design really right, maybe slightly above that policy. Again, higher is better. So it's not a new policy, but you are continuing to be in compliance. And then the last thing I wanted to share is on the utilities, and page 11. This is where we are suggesting, or not suggesting, the policy states that we want to have a certain amount of reserves in the utility fund, at least $3 million or 50% of the system revenues. You've operated at a much higher level in the utility fund. It's had very good reserves. You can see on the table on the left, but the right-hand column of that table, you've been 100+% for a number of years. Now our model projects, right, and we're showing projections out to 2030, and we know there's a fair amount of capital running through that model, whatever the capital might be for utility system. And so that's why we're showing here on the graph that the reserve level comes down and we flatline it at 50%. The idea is, depending on how the capital plan evolves, we do expect to use those reserves down to the policy level so that we don't have to rely so much on debt. But that will be a year-by-year decision. The point is, I think, you're in compliance and then some. And when you're assessing capital needs in the utility system, that cash above your policy is a resource that you can choose to use.
You're dropping that much, am I assuming, because of that proposed water project from Monkey to the...
I think that was the big driver. In the model, we don't necessarily spend it on any particular project. We just say, hey, we're above our policy. We got capital needs coming. Let's spend the reserves so we don't fall below our policy, but it's probably driven by that project. The idea is, before we issue any debt, we want to make sure we're utilizing the excess reserves we have. But again, that will be a decision on a year-by-year, project-by-project basis to make sure everybody's comfortable with that. But yes, that's probably the biggest driver of the utility CIP. So anyway, that's what we wanted to share. I think it's a really good policy document. You want to avoid it becoming a manual or something, but I think it strikes that balance. It's still at a high enough level that it is manageable for people to look at and understand and use. And I think the agenda item suggests a recommendation.
Thank you. Mr. Cole, anybody have any questions or comments for him? I'd just like to add that I think these policies, how long they've been in place ever since I've been on the board. So
I think we first put them in place maybe in 06 time frame.
Yeah, so I really feel like we've done I think these policies we do a good job. It gives the board something to look at when we're making big decisions, and I feel like we've done a pretty good job managing the taxpayers' finances over the years and making good decisions on debt and refinances. So with y'all's help. With that,
Mr. Chair,
Ms. Pearson?
I move to adopt revision 4 of the New Kent County financial policies as presented.
Thank you, Ms. Pearson. Any other comments? Ms. Watkins, will you poll the members, please?
Mr. Moyer?
Aye.
Ms. Pearson?
Aye.
Mr. Steers?
Aye.
Ms. Stewart?
Aye.
And Mr. Evelyn?
Aye. Motion passed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next item is FY 25, tax levies on real and personal property. Ordinance O-04-24. Mr. Hathaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Actually, this is an exciting process for me. We're near the end of a process that began summer of last year. As our annual budgeting process usually kicks off around the end of August, where we look at existing capital funds and meet with every department to determine what projects can be returned what funds can be returned back to our capital fund as we begin the CIP process and then move on to operating. So it's been a long process with a lot of input and collaboration between our budgeting team and departments, as well as with the community as well, with the public hearings and public meetings we've had. the first item you have before you is to consider FY25 tax levies on real property and personal property. Just like to note, with this ordinance before you, O-04-24, the only change proposed here is the levy on our real estate rate, which would change from 57 cents to 59 cents.
Thank you, Mr. Hathaway. Any discussion on that?
I'll say, Mr. Chair, I have thoughts that I would like to share. And while this is super exciting for Mr. Hathaway, this has been really heavy on my heart as my first budget process, and I think everyone understands how seriously I've taken it. And with the great help of everybody else sitting up here, you've heard me say before that the residents of District 5 put me here to be their voice, and I think unlike members of previous boards, I'm here to serve the interests of my district and not the Stewart family's personal interest. And by doing that, I've consulted and reached out to the residents of my district at every step of the process, including in this budget process, and I think probably most in this budget process, besides our VDOT issues and exciting times. And my constituents have shared with me a lot of tough decisions they're having to make in their personal budgets, and a lot of them have been discovering that they no longer have discretionary spending in their budget, and others have shared that they have had to decide whether to pay their taxes or buy a more reliable vehicle. And as someone that drives a lot to get to and from work, I understand that and relate to that a lot. And I think our budget, based on this proposed ordinance, has good parts in it. Like our school board requests being satisfied, and our fire and rescue and law enforcement mid-year increases being satisfied, even though they were postponed by our previous board's re-election desires. I think that my district put me here to be their voice and to view this through a truly fiscal conservative lens and not just give them lip service. And I've really, really, really done that. Like I said, it's been heavy on my heart as we look at every single dollar. And I think we're primed for a tactical pause, so that we can examine every dollar, every taxpayer dollar that's brought into this county as a result of this ordinance, and just make sure we understand how it's spent, especially after such a significant reassessment, and our surrounding counties, James City, Hanover, and Henrico, not increasing the taxes. And I don't have to say again that I've spent time on this, but I've really thought about what would best represent my district and what decision I should make on their behalf. And earlier this month, I was leaning one way as we went through this process, and we proclaimed May as Older Americans Month, and it just further made me lean to the way I was thinking already. So as we get into all the decisions we're going to make following this, I just want to thank our finance team. And I know we're a member down, but I know Rebecca helped us a lot, and Andrea, and just everyone going through the process, and Chief Opet, Deputy Chief McLaughlin, Sheriff Bailey, Dr. Nichols, and our school board for helping me understand the obligations and how our priorities and how we got to this ordinance. But I want to be abundantly clear to anyone that wants to listen to this in the future, anyone that's sitting here, that I believe that a tax increase only promotes overexpanded government and overburdens an already burdened tax base. And our residents are they're the overburdened tax base. And I think that, as their discretionary spending is disappearing, I think we have to take a long, hard look at our local government's discretionary spending and really evaluate what that means to our county and how we move forward. So thank you for letting me share that and be my therapist for the day. But, again, thank you for everybody up here that's worked to get to this point, because it has been a labor of love. So that's it. Thank you.
And I would like to make one comment that, there's surrounding counties that advertised that there were no tax increases. a lot of those counties went through reassessments this year too and decided to hold their rate flat. Although the values did increase significantly, they just did not equalize the rate. I think our process is a lot more transparent as we advertise the equalized rate, whereas some localities don't do that. So we show the true increase where that's not always the case. So.
Mr. Steers?
What?
Oh, I thought you had your mic on. You want to speak?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have a question. I've asked a couple people, and I get a couple different answers, and maybe Mr. Cole, since he's still here, he could help us. But let me find it. I was zipping through here. My question is, are we allowed to take funds out of the proposed CIP budget and put it into the operating budget as long as the budget hasn't been adopted yet? I've been told yes, and I've been told no, and I've been told I don't know. But that's an answer that I need.
Well, in this current budget, we're proposing to utilize CIP funds for operating expenses, hopefully on a temporary basis. So yes, it is something that can be done.
It can be done.
Now, with this policy you've just adopted, though, in keeping with the policy, we are making a statement that we will replace that money within a 3-year period if we do.
I think Mr. Steers might be talking about maybe if you took like vehicles out or of the budget or something.
Can you amend the? Yes, definitely. We can make changes up until adoption,
well,
and even after adoption, we can.
Can we
amend
go through that before we go through adopting the budget? I mean, that has a bearing on it.
I'd be happy to go through that again. I mean, yes, definitely.
Is it okay with you, Mr. Chairman?
That's fine. What?
And I'm sorry I don't have copies of the document for you, but it is in the budget document if you have your budget document. And I can run through that. Just need to find it.
So, Mr. Steers,
Just a second, because the print is kind of small.
what you're basically saying is that we should take, if we purchase vehicles, we should take that out of capital versus out of operating?
That is not what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. Well, that I would have agreed to that.
What I'm saying, though, is just like we have in the CIP budget to vehicle replacement. And I think I mentioned this to Mr. Hathaway a couple of weeks ago. What is the county's policy on vehicle replacement? And I think he said he thinks it's about 125,000 miles. And to me, that's ludicrous. I mean, there are people who go to car lots and purchase a truck that's already got 100,000 miles on it. 125,000 miles on a vehicle today is not like the vehicles we used to buy in the 60s. You know what I'm saying? Of course, Mr. Dombrowski, you weren't even here, so you wouldn't have any clue what I'm talking about. But I don't see why we need to replace all these vehicles when they have plenty of miles left on them. That, to me, that's one way to address what Ms. Stewart is saying about cutting spending instead of looking at adding taxes.
I would just like to add, our vehicle replacement policy, it's 100,000 miles for public safety vehicles, 125 for all others.
Right.
And there's also a requirement that if the maintenance cost exceeds a certain value of the car,
right.
Then that vehicle can be considered for replacement. I would also like to add that when we replace vehicles, most of those vehicles go to the schools to be utilized until their end of life. So we're not getting rid of vehicles. So if we do hold on to our vehicles longer, I mean, we could end up in a situation where potentially the schools would be buying more, but definitely we have that option to make changes.
Well, that was just a suggestion. I'm open for any comments that any other board member would have.
How many vehicles are in the CIP right now?
I believe there are 7 vehicles proposed for replacement in the sheriff's department. We do have our general pool car proposed to be replaced. There is
So essentially, Mr. Hathaway, we would be taking one-time funds and putting them into the operating budget? Is that, I mean, those were set-aside funds?
no, we purchase our vehicles out of our capital
Right,
fund.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So for future years, we're using funds that were designated as capital that we would have to fund in future years with something, correct? I mean, if we're
Yes.
taking that out of our capital and we're putting it into our operating budget and we're passing that budget now, next year, where will those funds come from?
Well,
I think that's the question. I think he's trying to, I think that's why so many people are telling him yes or no, because it's not.
right.
It's not very.
It's a couple.
If we are purchasing these vehicles, these 7 vehicles to be replaced,
Yes,
and that's a one-time purchase.
that's correct.
So it's coming out of capital.
Yes, it is.
So there's no reason to replace it
That's correct.
in the future.
Right. It's a capital.
So there's no, with purchase of those 7 vehicles, there is no operating expense
That's
that occurs versus normal. So however we do that differently would not change our tax rate, correct?
right. This
Okay.
is not going to, the purchase of the vehicles will have no impact on your operating expenses. This is purely a capital purchase.
And Mr. Steers, maybe this question is for you. Is your thought process here that, because I understand what everyone is saying about this is a one-time expense, so we don't, it's spent, it's done, we get the vehicles. Well, we're going to have another one-time expense next year when 7 other vehicles need to be replaced. I think that what I think Mr. Steers is talking about is re-examining how we manage our fleet so that we are not replacing them as often. And maybe we're replacing 3 now and 3 next year, or further examining how we cut the costs within the department's vehicles. We know that some are essential, and we know that some sit in this parking lot every day, all day, and are not used. So I think that's, well, tell me if that's not the correct characterization of what you were saying.
I guess that's why you work for the state. You can explain it better.
That's not why.
But that's what I'm trying to get at is, that's $719,000. If we could pull that out of CIP, then could we put that into the operating budget?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. So if you didn't purchase the 7 vehicles, could you use those funds for operating?
That's what I was asking.
Yes, you could, but again, we would have to follow our policy by making a commitment to put those funds back into capital within the 3-year period. But yes,
Right.
you can reduce those funds. And
Now,
But you're still going to have to find funds for vehicles the following year somewhere.
yeah, well,
Well, and the operating expense next year, where's the funding for that operating expense that we're funding with the capital expense? Where's that coming from?
it's coming from hopefully growth in the budget. Yeah, but you're right, because there's going to be other needs competing with that as well. So,
well, that's every year.
Yeah.
and
Mr. Steers,
what Mrs. Stewart said, and Mr. Steers, I do think that that's something we should do and will do as staff as far as look at our vehicle replacement policy. I agree. I mean, that is a policy that's been in place for over 10 years, and I know within that time period, they're making vehicles a lot better than they once were. So I think
that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yes.
And I'm not certainly talking about the sheriff's cars. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about
all vehicles.
like all these pickup trucks, like Ms. Stewart said, that sit in this parking lot all weekend, all summer.
Mm-hmm.
To me, they don't need a new vehicle every 125,000 miles.
Well,
How
we'll
many
look at that
vehicles are there?
policy.
Would you just, one pool vehicle, I think I saw, and
That one pool vehicle replaces a 2005 or 2006 Escape that we are having more and more maintenance issues with. But it's one pool vehicle. I believe there is a Commissioner of Revenues vehicles for the tax assessor in there.
Do you know how many miles are on each one of those vehicles?
Yes, we do. And when the departments submit their vehicle replacement requests to us, they have to submit the mileage
Right.
as well as any maintenance costs that they've experienced within the past year.
Mr. Hathaway, how much in Colonial Downs revenue will we have to repay within 3 years out of this budget?
Well, we're utilizing about a little over $1.9 million of Colonial Downs revenues in the operating budget this year, although I believe it's $433,000 of that is being used specifically for one-time expenditures. So I would say that we don't have to repay that. So we're looking at about $1,450,000.
About 3 cents
Yes.
that we're counting on future growth to help with.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to say, too, that a lot of my citizens, the District 3 citizens, have contacted me and are extremely grateful that it was lowered from a 7-cent increase to a 2-cent increase. And there's very little discretionary expenditures in the budget right now. And I did go through the budget line item by line item and cut about $300,000 of that. And just like nobody likes to raise taxes, but just like households, the electricity has gone up. The regular operating expenses for the county have gone up, just as they have for citizens. So.
I mean, I know when this budget first started off, I mean, I don't think any of us sitting up here, we're going to support a way to support a 7 cents increase, especially in these times. And I feel like as a board, and we've done a really good job working with staff, cutting this budget down. And I'm sure the supervisors in here every year, I mean, they come in and put what they need, but I went through the budget just like every year, very close, and there's always, some little things that can be cut in then and there, and we cut some big things before we got to that, but I feel like staff and this board did a good job presenting this budget. And I'll be honest, I haven't had the first phone call, the first email, anybody complaining about this budget. I mean, I've been out talking to citizens, asking what they thought, just trying to get some feedback. But when it came out at 7 cents, I got a few phone calls, a few emails. But after we went there and cut it, I haven't had any calls, comments, or anything. So that's where I am.
To second that, actually, I didn't get any calls on the 7 cents. There was nobody sitting in the audience and nobody gave public hearing at 7 cents, and I am very thrilled that we were able to get it down to 2 cents. And as Mr. Hathaway mentioned, with the reassessment in my personal property, my taxes went up without when we did the equalization. So, I can see that other counties may not have had increase in taxes in millage, but they had increase in taxes and revenue because their property values went up. It has been interesting talking to other supervisors in other counties that we do ours one way, and a lot of other people do it differently. They have a one-year assessment. Mm-hmm. I think Charles City has a 5-year assessment, and their 5-year assessment happened to hit exactly at the downturn of the markets. Thus, their revenue was a problem, but they had their reassessment equalization was not a problem. I'd like to get a commissioner of revenue give us a report on what has happened with equalization and what has happened with the values of our property and how much the influence of the values of our property by a one-person purchase of 5,500 acres, and how that has increased our land costs, and that has increased the citizens' cost in taxes. Because that, I know that we look at land costs now, they're exorbitant versus where they were just 3 or 4 years ago. Now that will include Buc-ee's too. That was a $269,000 an acre purchase, and I understand that added to it. But with the purchase of 5,500 acres, you have made the amount of acreage a little more sparse, and sparse in any type of economical scheme means increase in price. So I'd like us to look at that a little bit differently, and I'd like to see what the Commissioner of Revenue thoughts on that would be.
I can definitely make that request to the Commissioner of Revenue. It might be better if she comes during the July meeting. Our Board of Equalization will be meeting next month, so we're still wrapping up that process. But yeah.
Yeah, no. All right, so, Mr. Steer, do you want to hold off on this and move to the next item?
Actually, we're going to be coming back and adopting the capital improvement budget.
Yeah.
So.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Are there any more comments on this ordinance? Not, I'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt ordinance 0-04-24 as presented to impose tax levies on real and personal property for the 2024-2025 tax year.
Thank you, Ms. Moyer. Any other comments? Ms. Watkins, will you poll the members?
Ms. Pearson?
Aye.
Mr. Steers?
Nay.
Ms. Stewart?
Nay.
Mr. Moyer?
Aye.
And Mr. Evelyn?
Aye. Motion passed. I think I would say to my fellow board members, this is a long process. It'd been nice to see some cuts that you could suggest if you will not support the budget. But
Suggestion, an alternative suggestion would have been nice.
yeah.
Have to say no. That's good.
We'll take a 5-minute break.
Breakfast is wearing off. Yeah, I think so. Luckily, I got a granola bar in my office. Good thing. I usually am good for like a snack, somewhere. I used to have like a big thing of crackers, but I ate them all. So I got to replace it, capital improvement.
Yeah, I didn't snacks. I'm glad to see that the pool car is in the replacement though, because I can be honest, I could take my personal car.
Me too.
I'm
that
afraid
bad?
to drive. Well, not that, I mean, it's got one mileage, but it is old and it's rarely used.
with you guys. I'm not gonna have any credit.
Call the meeting back to order. Next item is the adoption and appropriation of FY 2024-2025 Capital Improvement Program. Resolution R-14-24. Mr. Hathaway. Yeah, just a capital improvement. See how it goes.
All right. I'm sorry, that I've talked with a couple of you with regarding projects proposed in the CIP. I've heard from a couple of you regarding the athletic stadium request that was submitted by the schools. That project totals $2 million. Currently, we do not have that funded as a project, but we do have a capital set-aside funded that totals about $3.8 million. So if you would like to proceed with that project, we can pull that from our capital set-aside, if that's your will.
Mr. Hathaway, can you tell us a little bit about that project?
The athletic stadium request was submitted by the schools to turn the football field into an artificial turf. There's also improvement scheduled to the track. It would rebuild the track. It would also rebuild the concession stand and restroom facilities there.
Mr. Hathaway, I think I'm one of the ones that responded in a positive for this, not because I'm a former health and physical education teacher, but because one of the things I did, I reached out to Dr. Nichols and asked, is there a return on this investment? And he said there could be upwards to $30,000 to $40,000 a year in maintenance fees, and that would not have to be used. So as looking forward to things like this, if we're able to spend capital money and then save operating money, I think these are a good way of approaching things in the future.
Anybody else?
Mr. Hathaway, can you say how much that project was and how much we have in the reserve again, please?
We have a reserve for future capital projects. I don't have the exact dollar amounts, but it's in excess of $3.8 million. The school's request for the athletic stadium upgrades total $2 million.
What's the desire of the board?
Was there also talk of expanding the historic school as well?
It's a different item.
That's my next question.
My concern with doing it this year is, we don't know exactly where our biggest capital revenue is going to be, what's that going to look like next year with the Colonial Down situation. So,
and
my concern would be hold off a year. My position.
And
hold off a year on the school? The track, okay.
And, that money, again, is being set aside. So if at any point during the fiscal year you decide to move forward with that, it's just a budget amendment. We would be required to do a public hearing for that. But it's a budget amendment. And I do know, I believe the schools, they would like to set up some time with you to talk about future capital needs as well. So this could be part of the discussion. I believe their meeting request is more geared to the actual school facilities, but definitely we can include this in the conversation too.
Yeah, and I think it's more transparent to have the public hearing on something that large too. outside of the budget process? Because I haven't heard,
Okay. And the second item, currently, well, in the original CIP proposal, there was $1.8 million proposed for a new community center to be located at Warnock Trail that would also serve as a voting precinct for the Eltham voting district. We had discussed previously at a previous board meeting, and I just want to confirm that we would remove the $1.8 million from that project and put that on the historic school renovation project to look at creating more office space in this building by relocating some offices located here into the historic school, as well as utilizing the historic school for community space. If that is still the will, we will proceed with that. I just want, seeking confirmation before we start spending money on architectural designs with the historic school.
I think I brought this up last time, Mr. Hathaway, but would any of the office moves to the historic school include our registrar or relieve any of the space needs for them?
We're looking at, it would not include the registrar at this time. What's been discussed is moving the Commissioner of Revenue's office, and if we move that office, then we really need to move the Treasurer's office as well, because they work hand in hand. And also looking at Parks and Recreation and Extension going there too. We can do an analysis to see if there's additional room for the registrar too.
Okay. I think it's every electoral board meeting they say we need more space, we need more space, we need to better comply with the requirement to be visible to the public. So I think no matter where we put that and what building they go in, I think that's an important consideration when we look at space needs and allocating money for that.
Okay.
So is everybody okay with the 1.8 going? Because we hear over and over space needs.
No, I don't need a motion for those questions, but you do have the CIP resolution before you, which we do need a motion. Well, we're good. Based on the responses that I've received on the questions, we don't need to make any additional changes to the CIP, so we're good.
Is it a motion for the adoption of the resolution?
all right, Mr. Chair, I'll move to adopt Resolution R-14-24 to adopt and appropriate the New Kent County, Virginia fiscal year 2024 to 2025 capital improvement program.
Ms. Watkins, we poll the members.
Mr. Steers?
Aye.
Ms. Stewart?
Aye.
Mr. Moyer?
Aye.
Ms. Pearson?
Aye.
And Mr. Evelyn?
Aye. Resolution adopted. Next item is amendment to Appendix A fees of New Kent County Code Ordinance O-05-24.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. As part of our annual budget process, we evaluate all fees that we collect to make sure they match the cost of the services that we provide. As a result of that evaluation, we do have some minor increases proposed for our airport. Again, these increases are minor. They're still pretty far below a lot of the surrounding airports around us. We do have some proposed amendments for the building permit fees, adding new fees, increasing fees for amusement devices and rides where we're required to inspect any mechanical ride, as well as a missed inspection fee to encourage contractors to call for inspections when they're truly ready for the inspection. We have some public safety fee amendments with emergency services, And the, I guess, most significant fee amendment, and it's significant because we've not had a utility service fee increase in a while, but we are proposing a 4% service fee increase for our utilities.
Any questions for Mr. Hathaway on the fee changes? Done, I'll entertain a motion on the amendment.
So, Mr. Chair, I move to adopt ordinance O-05-24 as presented, amending Appendix A, fees, general government fees of the New Kent County Code.
Thank you, Ms. Stewart. Watkins, would poll the members?
Ms. Stewart?
Aye.
Mr. Moyer?
Aye.
Ms. Pearson?
Aye.
Mr. Steers?
Aye.
And Mr. Evelyn?
Aye. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hathaway.
Yes.
And Josh, I think I'd like to go back and change my vote on the tax levies and real personal properties because, I'm sitting here thinking, I've always been extremely conservative, and I'd like to see what kind of cuts my other board members were proposing to get it down to 57 cents.
Mr. Chairman, so if you would like to change your vote.
I have a question to our county attorney. If we change the vote to the tax levies, we've adopted a budget based on that tax levy. So I think essentially we would probably have to amend that motion as well.
That's correct, Mr. Hathaway. So the process to reconsider something already disposed of would be a motion to reconsider the action. And the vote required to do that, it would have to be made by somebody who, it would have to be a 2/3 vote required to, for that vote to pass, which means 2/3 out of 5 is 4. So someone would need to make a motion to reconsider that previous vote, and then 4 out of 5 of the board members would need to agree on that particular item, on the motion to reconsider. And that would bring the original item back to the board for consideration. But like Mr. Hathaway said, we would also have to reconsider the capital improvement program because it was based on the tax levy.
Well, item 6 is based on the tax levy, correct?
Right.
We haven't voted on yet. We haven't voted on that yet. The capital improvement program.
Mr. Hathaway, the capital improvement program not based on the tax levy at all?
It could have an impact, but I guess we could move forward without reconsidering that.
Well, item 6 is supported by item 3, correct?
I'm sorry.
The adoption of the budget itself.
Right, we
haven't
haven't
adopted the budget, that's why.
So
Right.
we would just defer that.
So that's really what needs to be amended first, is item 6, correct?
Yeah, we could proceed with the capital improvement program. If there's any drastic changes that may impact the CIP, we could always come back and I guess amend it at that time. So, we could keep the CIP approval in place.
So, item 2 or item 6?
Item
2 or 6?
Reconsidering
I mean,
item 3.
3 and 6, which goes first?
Well, if you, depending on what action or what new actions you take on item 3,
Okay.
we could potentially defer item 6.
Okay.
Well, and I'm pretty sure, I mean, item 6 is supported by item 3.
Right.
So I'm pretty sure I'm.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we reconsider the votes for item 3, which is FY25 tax levies on real and personal property, ordinance 0-04-24.
And Mr. Chairman, I would just like to clarify, it requires only a majority vote, not a 2/3 vote.
Can I ask a clarifying question? If we reconsider this and the goal is to seek our input on further cuts, what's the timeline for approving a new budget then, based on that?
Well, per state code, we need to adopt the budget by June 30th.
I believe I can check the Virginia code as well, but there is also a requirement that there's the public hearing be within a certain time period of the resolutions authorizing it. So and the public hearing can't be done today, so we would need to hold some sort of advertised special meeting with 2 weeks of advertisement. So it's got to be 2 weeks out from today, hold a public hearing.
We're lowering it. We're not raising it.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Well, I would assume that, we've been working on this thing for months, that there's got to be something there.
Yeah, we have time.
No. All right, there's a motion on the table. Ms. Moore, any discussion? Ms. Watkins, poll the members.
Mr. Moyer,
Aye.
Ms. Pearson,
Aye.
Mr. Steers.
Aye.
Ms. Stewart,
Aye.
and Mr. Evelyn.
Aye. All right, I'm going to ask Ms. Stewart and Mr. Steers what suggested cuts they have to get to the 2 cents.
Do you want me to provide those to you right now?
Yeah.
So I am not prepared to give you my cuts at this moment, but I would be happy to give you my cuts at another time. And I understand your frustration.
Yeah, I do, because you're looking, this is the most important job we do as supervisors.
Right.
And as you come up here and spoke that you want to keep it at 57 cents, you haven't talked to any other board members, any staff, and you're not providing us with anything that they were supposed to adopt the budget, and you can't give us a cut?
Sure. Well, I started this conversation, with Mr. Hathaway very early on when he and I were walking through McHenry Woods, saying that I was not in a place to support a tax increase. Because I just don't believe that's what the residents of my district want. I think that you have said multiple times that all you need is 3 votes, and I was under the impression that, the 3 votes were there to support the budget. So for me, I can represent my district well and let you guys represent your district well, because you're not in an area of making cuts. And
Oh, my goodness.
And I want to be respectful of all of you, and I enjoy the relationship we have working together, and I would be happy to write a list of cuts I believe, but I'm not prepared at this time to give them to you. I would be happy to do that by the end of the day if you would like. And again, I apologize for, the hurt feelings we might have, but I believe that we can all disagree on things and work well together.
The feelings on her, I'm not worried about the feelings. I'm worried about trying to, provide a professional. Which I've never been through this on a board member. In a meeting since I've been on the board. If somebody want to make cuts, you should be presenting to the other 4 board members to try to get it down to 2 cents and show us how we can get to it. I think we're all don't want to have a tax increase. We said that from day one. You should have gotten with staff so we could. Your job as supervisors to convince us to get it down to 57 cents. And can you just give me one cut? $1 million. You can't give us one cut that you try to get the $1 million.
the cuts that I was looking at, that's why I was trying to clarify if we could take money out of the CIP proposed budget and transfer it over to the operating budget. And what I was trying to get to was to get the tax rate, no tax increase on real estate. Also, to the $1.8 million that was proposed for the center over in at District 5. I mean, I've had many people over there. It's not even my district, but they've called me and said they don't want it. Even one of our former supervisors said, "Ron, we don't want that. Don't do it." But to take that money and take the money we could save on vehicle replacement, that we would have enough not to have to raise taxes, plus look at funding the request from our fire chief that is in desperate need of additional funding. That was what I was trying, the figures I was trying to come up with. And I was looking for guidance to get to that number. Does that make sense?
We already
I
have.
want to get to the 57 cents.
Yeah, we already have 1.5 million that we're waiting on growth to pay back to the Colonial Downs funds. If we put operating funds into this budget that equate to however much, that's another 2 or 3 cents probably that we're relying on future growth for.
Yeah, and there is a concern, you know, with the adoption for the public. I know you guys know. With the adoption of the state budget, it appears that at the 11th hour, there was language added into the state budget that created a work group, that creates a work group to look at the redistribution of historic horse racing funding.
Yes, I saw that.
We feel that that language is specifically put in there to look at the funding that New Ken is receiving, and we feel that that is going to be redistributed somehow. So we're not going to be receiving the same capital revenue that we have gotten used to, and it's been nice to have. So with that, I would give some caution for utilizing additional capital funds because it's likely that we won't see that same revenue in out years.
Why don't we reconvene this meeting at 2:00? Have your cuts done, because you're going to need to know how it's going to impact. I mean, you're looking out for your constituents, and I think we all are. But the citizens that we represent, they're going to need to know how it affects our operating budget and our.
Mr. Chair, I will warn you that going through the budget line item by line item takes a little bit longer than that.
Well, but it should be. I mean, we're looking at it from us. We could. I mean, can we reconvene at 2:00?
I have a 1 o'clock meeting, so 2:30 or 3, please.
$3 o'clock. All right. We will reconvene the meeting at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Mr. Chairman, could we have a motion to that effect with a roll call vote?
I'll move to reconvene this meeting at 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Thank you, Ms. Pearson. Mr. Watkins, will you poll the members?
Ms. Pearson? Aye. Mr. Steers?
Aye.
Ms. Stewart?
Aye.
Mr. Moyer?
Aye.
And Mr. Evelyn?
Aye. We'll be back at 3.
So we've still got tax levy, operating budget,